Hello again, everybody. Lance Russell and Dave Brown right along ringside. By golly, we're about ready to go with more big action.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Georgia Championship Wrestling. I'm Gordon Solie, your host, and we have quite an hour in store for us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Championship Wrestling at ringside. This is Vince McMahon, along with wrestling's only living legend, Bruno Sammartino.
Welcome to this week's edition of Mid-South Wrestling Television. I'm your host, Boyd Pierce, another outstanding card.
Hey, guys, and welcome back to the Regional Rasslin Podcast, where we talk the territories. I am Ray Russell, and this week, oh boy, do we have a special guest for you. We're moving aside all of our current projects, because right now we're going to bring to you, he is the host of the popular podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle, former, we'll call him a writer, editor for the WWE magazine and publishing division. He is the author of Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real-life story of wrestling's original Sheik. And now he can add another wrestling masterpiece to those credits, Irresistible Force, the life and times of one Gorilla Monsoon. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to have here for the first time on the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. He is author, writer, wrestling historian. I guess maybe he would like the term wrestling superfan as well, but he is the one and only Mr. Brian R. Solomon. Welcome to Regional Rasslin.
Thank you, Ray. It's my honor to be here, really, truly. As I said before we started, I'm a big fan of your shows. I listen all the time. What you do is legit as far as wrestling history, and I'm thrilled to now get to be a part of it.
Oh, we're happy to have you, man. You know, Gorilla Monsoon, and like I told you off air as well, I'm sure you've heard this a million times at this point, how many people grew up on Gorilla and super fans of Gorilla and just love the man. And I think we all believe we loved him the most, right? And I think I felt like that. He was kind of like that. Even though my grandparents raised me, he was also like a surrogate grandfather to me on Mondays or Tuesday nights, whichever time prime time was on. I needed that to go to sleep. I was comfort zone by the time that was over. I don't know. He was just such a calming voice to my childhood, but, you know, certainly a voice to the wrestling masses. And I was telling you right before we got on the air that, you know, I was born in 1980. So when National Expansion hit, when Rock and Wrestling hit, I was about 5 years old, and it was all over everything. NBC, I'd see Hulk Hogan and Mr. T in the bumpers or the wraparounds and the cartoons jogging down the streets of New York City. And of course, like, what is this stuff? I got to watch it. And Gorilla Monsoon became the voice of my entire childhood all the way into the, you know, mid 1990s.
Yeah. And it's a good feeling. I have to say, it's a good feeling to be writing a book about somebody that makes so many people happy. It's like you just mention his name. I mentioned I wrote a book about him, and people instantly get happy and start telling me stories like what you're telling me. It's just, it's nice that he brought that out of people. You know, when I did the Sheik book, it was very different. You know, the people, when I would mention him to people that remembered him, they were afraid of him, or they hated him when they were kids, or there were some people in the business that were not crazy about him. You know, there were mixed opinions about him. With Gorilla, nothing like that. I mean, it's just overflowing adoration from fans and people in the business.
Yeah, Gorilla Monsoon, of course, he had that entire career in the ring before he ever became an announcer, but I knew him as an announcer as a kid, but he would always reference, boy, back in my day, I'm glad I'm retired. Wait a minute, Gorilla was a wrestler? And then you would get those little bits and pieces on Coliseum Video. Right. And it was like, it made my day, from the Muhammad Ali to just the Wolf Man and the biggest, smallest, strangest, strongest, anything they could find to throw these little pieces of Gorilla out there. And then the Andre match in Puerto Rico, which, oh my God. And so and then he takes the bump in the wet tarp.
Yes. Yes.
So, but I mean, I was just in heaven being able to see these little chunks of Gorilla Monsoon in action, but he had been a monster heel prior to that babyface run in the 1970s. And so there's so much to get into here, but I got to ask you, because this has been bothering me for 25 years, and maybe you have an answer, maybe you don't. But many, many moons ago, I remember walking somewhere and just randomly going, why is there no Gorilla Monsoon book? Shoot interviews were out. People were spilling the beans. Of all the people that had such a career in the ring, behind the scenes, why is there no Gorilla Monsoon book? And I thought to myself, hey, I spend so much time doing wrestling stuff. Maybe I could make a Gorilla Monsoon. And of course I never did. But where do you start is the question I asked myself back then. So I got to ask you, is there an actual answer to the reason why it took this long for someone to put together Irresistible Force, this Gorilla Monsoon story?
I don't have an exact answer, but I will tell you that I definitely ask the same question many times. And one interesting thing came up. I talked to his family. We were talking about this, and even they were surprised and wondering why they didn't do more about him. But they did tell me that back in the day, you know how they're doing these A&E biographies now of the WWE wrestlers? Well, I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, like kind of around the Attitude Era, there was a first wave of A&E biographies of some WWF stars. They did a Stone Cold Steve Austin. I think they did an Andre the Giant. And there was going to be, at that time, there was going to be a Gorilla Monsoon. But something happened. One of the episodes they did, Vince McMahon was unhappy about it, where it was very negative. I'm not sure which one, or he thought it was. And he pulled the plug on the whole thing. He pulled the plug on it. And he said, I'm not going to cooperate with you anymore. Now, apparently, A&E said to the Morella family, we still want to do this episode. We just can't use any WWF photography or video footage. And the family was like, you can't do it then. It's pointless to do it. What are you going to just have baby pictures? And so it never happened. As far as anything else, books and things, I honestly wish that I knew. It's not like he's persona non grata or anything. Right. There's been books about Andre the Giant, Pat Patterson, other people behind the scenes. Blassie got a book, right? But also Blassie was alive at the time. So that might have been part of it. Maybe if Gorilla had lived, Gorilla died, if you remember, like just as that book boom was taking off in wrestling. And maybe there would have been one if he'd lived a few years more.
Boy, that would have been spectacular. So, okay, you are the man. You decide. Many people probably thought about it over the history. I'm going to make a Gorilla book, and they just kind of put it in the back of their head, and it doesn't come to fruition. You actually take charge, and you get it done, man. And I'm so excited that it's out there now, that people can actually live the life of Gorilla Monsoon. And so what was the first step that you took? Did you say, I got to contact the Morella family? I mean, what was the very first step that you knew you had to do in order to put this whole thing together properly?
Well, yeah, that was it. I mean, I knew I had to start putting feelers out to the Morellas, and I had a little PTSD on this because the Sheik's family, unfortunately, and they're good people. I'm really good friends now with his granddaughter, Susie. She's wonderful. And I've met his daughter-in-law, Carrie. They were very kind to me when I went out there. But at the time of the book, Eddie Farhat Jr. was kind of the spokesperson of the family. And he just wanted no part of it. And then he and his brother got sick and passed. And it was very complicated. So this time out, I wanted to really try to not have that happen. And I proved myself to them. It was a process of really showing them I was serious and this was a legit book. And that made the difference. But I reached out to Valerie first because she was kind of easier to find online. Excuse me. Valerie is his daughter. And she helped make the introduction to Maureen, his widow, his wife, who was still with us at the time. And we got to meet a few times and it was really wonderful. But that was the first step. And of course, then jumping into research and stuff and starting to, get materials together. It's, this is my 6th book. So it's sort of like an automatic, machine that starts working in my brain at this point.
Well, it's always good to have that in the back pocket, that you've already went through this before. Maybe you encounter something different every time, especially with the Sheik situation. It kind of had you prepared for pretty much anything after that, I'd have to imagine. So before we get into all the good stuff, just one more quick question in regards to developing the book. And that is, how long would you say roughly time frame from when you said, I'm going to make a Gorilla book, to when you actually started on the Gorilla book? And then time frame of from beginning to end, how long did it take to put that book together?
Well, the whole thing all told was probably about 3 years. And that includes, even though like the writing of it was probably half of that. But, in late 2022, I kind of got the idea to do it. It was actually suggested to me on a podcast by Dr. Mike Lano. So I have to give him credit for that. Yeah, he mentioned the name and a light bulb went off in my head. And then I started thinking about it and thinking this could really work. And so by the end of 2022, I had pitched it to ECW Press. They accepted instantly. There wasn't even a question. They wanted to do this. And so in early 2023, I started, the research and the phone calls and the interviews. That takes a lot of time, and transcribing the interviews, which is probably the most tedious part of the whole thing. So that by the summer of 2023, I was starting the writing, and it took such a long time, that longer than I thought. I mean, I blew the deadline on the Sheik book, but I really blew the deadline on this one, because this book was originally supposed to come out in the spring of this year, and I was supposed to be done with it. I was supposed to originally be done with it in, like, let me think about this. No, I finished it around September, October 2024. That's when I finished it. I was originally supposed to finish it in May of 2024. Gotcha. And I'm like, guys, this isn't working. And not only that, I went about 100 pages over the page count limit they gave me. It was just exploding. And they said, go for it. And so instead of having it come out around WrestleMania time this year, which was their original plan, it's more of like a pre-Christmas release. So
it's Christmas come early for me, Brian. I'll give you that much there. And good things come to those who wait. I'd rather it be good than quick. You know what I mean? So that's awesome that, you took that extra time to get it all in. And I'm glad they said, put it in, fun. And you got everything going. And I'm so, excited to have this in front of me now. And another thing that you didn't really touch on, I would listen to your recent interview you did with Jim Cornette. You guys didn't get to it there. And I definitely wanted to touch on it here. We were talking about it off air. Was the foreword was written by the one and only, the Hitman, Bret Hart. And so how did that come about? And how did that work for you?
I was so pleased because first of all, I didn't know so much about the connection between Gorilla and the Hart family. Although looking back on it, it's obvious now because he always talked about them on commentary. He always spoke warmly about Stu and Helen. In fact, he played a big part in getting that whole thing over, the dungeon, the Hart family, Calgary. And so I wasn't sure about who was going to do this forward because, to be honest with you, a lot of the people that would have been the first choices are dead, or somebody like Vince McMahon, who is never, that's not going to happen. And so it was Tom Burke, who is a great wrestling historian, collector, super fan, as you called me. I'm good friends with him. He lives in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from where I live. And we've spent time together. He introduced me to Ross Hart, Bret's brother. Right. Ross had been stayed at his place for a few days to check out all of his memorabilia and stuff. And I interviewed Ross, and Ross put me in touch with Bret. Ross said, Bret, did you know that Bret is very fond of Gorilla? You should talk to him. And I started thinking about it, and because he was saying how much of a part he played in his career. And not only he gave him the nickname, obviously, Excellence of Execution, but he also pushed for him backstage. He was a real proponent of Bret Hart, and he was in favor of, pushing him to the moon, making him one of the top guys. And I thought, wow, okay, that would be great if he would do this. I mean, everybody knows and loves Bret Hart. He's another one like Gorilla. And he agreed. I knew him briefly when I worked for WWE. I had interviewed him before, but it was a long time ago, and I didn't expect him to remember. But it went really well. He was so gracious. He not only wrote the foreword, but he also offered me a big interview for the book. There's a lot of quotes from Bret in the book, and he wrote that foreword. Those are all his words. I didn't change a thing. In fact, he suggested a couple of changes and things that he wanted. I made those. He was very involved, and I can't thank him enough. It was just fantastic.
No, that's very cool. When you have a book about Gorilla Monsoon and the foreword written by one of the greatest of all time, the Hitman. And there, and when I think of Gorilla and Bret together, you don't really think of that a lot. Now, I know Gorilla had spent some time in Stampede. There's a little bit of footage out there of that as Bob Morell, I think, very early in his career. But he comes to the ring, WrestleMania 10, Bret Hart defeats Yokozuna, gets the belt back. And all the baby faces enter the ring to celebrate with Bret. Vince McMahon enters the ring. Gorilla Monsoon enters the ring. Gorilla, even though he was biased on commentary, sorry, Gorilla, but he never really got involved with the wrestlers. And it was so odd to see Gorilla, of all people, in the ring congratulating Bret Hart. And I have to wonder, I don't know if I want to call it an audible, but is that just Gorilla kind of, doing that specifically because it was Bret Hart there?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, he never did it for anybody else. Never. He never did it for Hulk Hogan, despite, putting him over to the moon all those years on commentary. Never did that. The thing is, one thing about that show at the Garden, I was there, by the way. I was in college at the time. And Gorilla was actually at ringside doing commentary
Radio
for
WWF,
Radio WWF. And I have never found that audio anywhere. I wonder if it's out there, because if it was, that is actually the last WrestleMania commentary of Gorilla Monsoon. If somebody could find that, it would be great. But he was paired up with Chet Kopic, who was, I think, some kind of a sportscaster or something. And so he was right there at ringside the whole show, right? Presumably right nearby. I guess it was Vince McMahon and Jerry Lawler who did the regular pay-per-view call.
Yeah, that was Lawler came back that night.
Right. And
incident.
And so he was right there when it happened. And you could imagine that he was very proud of Bret. Absolutely.
Yeah, Radio WWF, we had that here in our market, but the pay-per-views we did not. So I really, me too, that, now that you bring that up, that's Gorilla's last big WrestleMania. I would love to have heard his commentary, not just on that match, just for the night, because Gorilla was growing up. Gorilla was WrestleMania, him and Jesse for the first 6, in fact, and Bobby Heenan thereafter there for the next couple. So I guess we can jump around a little bit here. And since we're talking about Gorilla and commentary and commentator, who I grew up on, obviously, he takes over prime time from Jack Reynolds in the end of the summer of 1985. He's got prime time with Jesse. Jesse goes off to Hollywood. In comes Bobby, kind of as like a pseudo substitute kind of deal. And then they realize, well, Jesse's off doing things anyway, but they also realize there's some chemistry here. Magic begins, right? So let's talk a little bit about Gorilla and Bobby and that dynamic. Were they friends, before? I can't imagine they were as close as they became before they got together on primetime.
So, they got together on primetime in April 1986, and that was the beginning of their even just working together as commentators. They'd never done that before that. And so, and then, Bobby took over on All-Star Wrestling. He got Jesse's spot. But they had known each other. Bobby came into the company in September 84. They had never met before, according to both of their families, because I talked about that. They'd never had occasion to meet before. Bobby was in the AWA and the WWA. And, Gorilla used to go down to the NWA conventions and things, but I'm assuming Bobby didn't. So they'd never met before, but they had, by the time of prime time, known each other for about a year and a half. And from what I understand, they hit it off immediately. So they were already good friends by the time that started. And that just really clicked it, because then they were spending a lot more time around each other specifically. And they became the absolute best of friends. From what I understand, Arnie Skoland had been probably Gorilla's closest friend in the business for years and years. But I think that Bobby eclipsed that. I think Bobby really kind of became the greatest friend that he ever had. And like you said, the chemistry was off the charts. One of the best things that happened to Bobby Heenan was, the whole with Jesse Ventura, it was a combination of things. It was Hollywood Calling with Predator. It was the whole thing with him. He got suspended or whatever you want to call it when he was trying to create the union before WrestleMania 2. Right. So not only was there a gap where Bobby could step in, but what I also believe is that I think from that point on, Vince was very wary of Jesse. Not that he obviously kept using him for years, but I think in the back of his mind, he was thinking, I can't put all my apples in this basket here. Like, I need to have another really good heel commentator to work with these guys, because I can't fully trust Jesse. I do think that. And Bobby, you weren't going to get those problems from Bobby Heenan, so he was the guy.
Yeah, not to get off the topic of Gorilla at all, but I always felt like, because like you were talking about that whole union thing with Jesse and going off to Hollywood, I always felt there was like a combination of the Hollywood rub mixed with maybe Dick Ebersol and the whole Saturday Night's Main Event deal, telling Vince, you can't let this guy go. We want Jesse Ventura. Yeah. And so I feel like he was kind of a necessary evil for Vince moving forward, but I can see where it's like, well, we're going to use you a little less, but I'm sure Jesse was okay with that, because he was likely getting paid the same anyway.
Yeah, and also like we've been saying, the chemistry and everything was so great with Gorilla and Bobby that it's easy to see why they would say, let's have these guys do more together. And then, Gorilla and Jesse became more the strictly like pay-per-view team at that point.
Yeah, when they switched the format to primetime in the early spring of 91, there was nobody more upset than I. So I'll say that much.
Yeah, that was, I've said it many times, but I didn't get cable until the summer of 92, where I lived in Brooklyn. Our neighborhood wasn't wired for cable. You needed to have a giant satellite dish, which we didn't have. And so by the time I had heard a lot about primetime wrestling, by the time I was able to watch it, which was just a few months before it ended,
right,
it was just not good. It was not good. That was such a mistake, where Vince would have round table thing. And look, Vince is a lot of things. Vince had his strengths with commentary and as a TV presence. He was not funny. There was not like a sense of humor there.
He never clicked with Bobby either. He never.
No, he didn't. They were not good together. They just weren't. In fact, I remember, what was it? I think WrestleMania 7, where they worked together. No, that was Gorilla and Bobby. SummerSlam 92, they worked together. Vince and Bobby, and just no good. And when they would do, there's a few episodes of Primetime that Gorilla has to miss for various things that happen, and Vince sometimes steps in, and there's just no rapport. Vince never knew how to interact with the comedy guys like a straight man should. Honestly, it was the same with Lawler. He didn't quite know how to, like, Lawler or Bobby would come out with a gem or some great line, and Vince's thing would just be like, ha ha ha, or he would just go, well, I don't know anything about that, and then he would go on. Like, he didn't know how to interact in that way.
No, or he would scoff at, Bobby Heenan.
Right. Well, right. Just he didn't get the comedy part. He was good at the bombast and everything, but
yes, that's why Gorilla was so great. He was great with Jesse. He was great with Bobby in completely different directions too. These were two different type of characters he was working with. And I love the big fight feel of Jesse and Gorilla together. And you talked about Gorilla having to miss certain episodes of Primetime and things of that nature. And that leads me, this is on my short list of questions for you. I wasn't going to get there yet, but we might as well do it now. There were a couple of glaring omissions to Gorilla. They kept promoting the first ever Royal Rumble on USA Network, 1988. They kept selling, point was who the announcers were going to be. It was supposed to be Gorilla and Jesse. It winds up being like Vince and Bobby, even though Bobby had stated he was going off to Bermuda or something. He winds up being the commentator. I don't know why he replaced Jesse, but Vince replaces Gorilla last minute. And then we see Gorilla missing from Primetime for the next week or two as well. And I believe that's where he had his first mild heart attack. Yes. And then later on, SummerSlam 90, Gorilla is, I guess he would have been with Hot Rod. So it seems like both times he would have been with Jesse. Jesse dips out too. Jesse's fired at that point. But Roddy comes in and does Vince SummerSlam 90. And I think that's when Gorilla had an amputation to a toe or something, if I remember correctly. So, I mean, when did the health issues start with Gorilla? Obviously, he's a large man and maybe some other issues going on. But take me through either one of those situations if you have any information on them.
Well, he was first diagnosed with diabetes in his late 30s. And so this would have been like mid 70s. So he was living with it for years, but it wasn't really impeding his quality of life, as far as I know. But things started to get bad for him health-wise at that Royal Rumble time. The beginning of 1988, he had his first known heart attack. Although when he had it, the doctors said that they think that he had a few mini heart attacks before that. But the thing about it was we don't know to this day if either he didn't realize it himself or if he just didn't say anything to people. But he had a very serious one at the beginning of 88, and he had to miss some TV for that. And then what you mentioned, in the summer of 1990, the diabetes was getting very serious because the problem was, and that's when he started switching to insulin shots and things. The problem was he never really prioritized his health. He just didn't. He was one of these guys where it was like, I want to live my life. I'm not going to, I'll do some things, but I'm not going to change what I do. He was a heavy smoker. All those guys were. Mean Gene, Bobby Heenan, they all, Jim Ross. I mean, they all were heavy. That was the business. And he wasn't going to stop. He loved to eat. He loved the things. He tried to curtail, his family said, he tried to curtail he had a sweet tooth, but, like Valerie said, when you're on the road, it's very hard to eat healthy. Guys know this. And they would find, like Hostess wrappers and things in the car when he would get back from the road. And so, he had to have part of it was more like part of his foot. It was like a toe and part of the foot, because as people know, with diabetes, the part of it, the circulation in the extremities gets bad. And he had to relearn how to walk because he didn't want to come back to TV with a cane. He was very serious about that. So he waited. There were also a few TVs that he missed around this time because he lost his father and his brother within weeks of each other. And I don't remember, I don't have it in front of me. I think it's somewhere around this same time. So he had to miss some TVs for that too. And so around that time, from what I understand, because of the health things, I think that was when Vince started thinking, okay, I need to have a backup plan. I can't totally rely on Gorilla as much as I did. And I need to have other options, and you start seeing other people being used, newer, younger guys coming in.
Well, eventually the time would come. My Gorilla Monsoon figure here on my pay-per-views would slowly begin to disappear. And lo and behold, one WrestleMania 9, I turned it on, no announcement, no pre-announcement, no big sell, because we wouldn't do it that way. But all of a sudden, my WCW announcer, good old JR, Jim Ross, appears in a toga right there in Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas, Nevada. Where the hell's Gorilla Monsoon? No offense to Jim Ross. I was a huge WCW fan at the time. I knew who Jim Ross was. But where the hell's my Gorilla Monsoon? This isn't right. So I was kind of excited that Jim Ross was in the WWF. But at the same time, where's Gorilla? And there he is standing over here. Okay, what are they doing with him over here? He's kind of like the master of ceremonies. They got him in a toga. I don't know how much he liked that. Maybe he did. Gorilla seemed like a fun guy. But was he gracious and realized it was my time? Did he kind of want to get away from it? Was that too much for him at that age and that health situation? Or was he like, what's going on here?
Well, I had heard about that a little bit ahead of time because that was the heyday of my, there was no internet, but that was the heyday of my wrestling hotline obsession. And so there was a buzz that Jim Ross was coming over, that he was going to debut there. I loved him from WCW. I thought he added so much to the product. So I was excited. As you mentioned, Gorilla still opens the show, but he immediately throws it to Jim Ross. And it's kind of like, I describe it in the book as this perfect passing of the torch moment. I mean, it's him literally saying, and now we have a surprise for you. Here's Jim Ross. And Gorilla wound up, actually, there were no hard feelings. I think Gorilla's thing was he wanted to still be involved in some way. He always wanted to be on TV. That was part of his deal. He enjoyed being behind the scenes, going into the TV studio and stuff. But he was fine with his duties being reduced. I mean, he knew that his health was a factor. In fact, at that time, Valerie told me he was not in good shape. He was hurting badly. Like they had to pick him up at the airport when he came back from Vegas, and he was in rough shape, they said, very exhausted and stuff. So I think he was okay. He was really okay with that. The way he looked at it is it's less work for me. Like I've put in my time. I put in my dues. As long as you keep me around and keep paying me, I'm happy. And he became an advocate for Jim because Jim has talked about this before, but when he came in, he was seen as the enemy. Like there were people that didn't trust him. Chief Jay Strongbow, who didn't trust anybody. He didn't like Jerry Briscoe. Like he seemed to have problems with everyone. He saw him as a mole, as a spy, as a guy you couldn't trust. And Gorilla said no. I think Lord Alfred Hayes, too, had an issue with him. And Gorilla said, no. This guy has paid his dues. This guy is with us now. He's not the enemy. I think it didn't hurt that he was a Bill Watts protege because Gorilla and Bill Watts were very good friends. They had been tag team partners and champions together and had lived together for a little bit. And he said, this guy's we're going to show him the respect that he has earned. And when Gorilla said that, people fall into line and they listen. And I think Jim was very grateful for that.
I think Gorilla also a little deeper into the office than some of the guys like Alfred Hayes. And so Gorilla knew a little more I could see where, you know how wrestlers are, especially that old guard, where it's just kind of, let's make up the narrative and go along with it. And we believe our own story. And Gorilla was like, no, we're not doing that with him. This is the way it really is. He's not a spy. He's not coming over. They actually, released him. Eric doesn't want him here anymore. And now we welcome Jim Ross. Of course, Vince has his ups and downs with Jim over the next few years. They're hiring and firing and things like that. But no, I was just curious. I've always been curious about that because selfish me, it was like bittersweet. It was like, cool, JR's here. But it was also like, oh, I still want Gorilla though. It's like, I can't get both though.
No, it's true. And, everything comes to an end. It's funny. I don't think people realized how young he was, too. That's the thing. Like, he died at 62. He wasn't even collecting Social Security yet. No. And so at the time of WrestleMania 9, which was 93, he would have been not even, he would have been 55, just a few months away from 56. I mean, I think Michael Cole's older than that now. I'm pretty sure a lot older than that, I'm sure if he was in good health, we could have got a lot more out of Gorilla, unfortunately. But you could say that about his whole life. He just left us way too soon.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was quite a shocker when a lot of people bring it up now, but I remember sitting in my bedroom with two of my cousins and my brother. Everybody was over to watch WrestleMania, and they cut to Gorilla out there, the last video of Gorilla on the WWF TV. Best I can remember anyway.
All right.
And I didn't even know who it was initially. I didn't know who it was initially. And it said Gorilla Monsoon, and I just remember a collective gasp. Everybody in the room, and I remember going, "Oh my God, is that Gorilla Monsoon?" And just being so scared, like, what the hell's going on here? You could see the decline in health, and it just didn't look like Gorilla.
Right, because he hadn't been on television since SummerSlam '97. That was the last time they put him on TV, when they gave the commemorative title belt to the governor of New Jersey in the ring, and he was in there. But the thing is, by that point, he had already had another very serious heart attack. He had it in the month before, somewhere in the summer of '97, and that's when they took him off television as the president. And that one was so bad that they took him off TV permanently at that point. He was home for like 6 months. He actually came back at the beginning of 1998, but he was not front and center. He was doing he started doing some voiceovers for international TV. He was doing he was showing up to the local events and still going into the studio. They just weren't putting him on television. So when he showed up at WrestleMania 15, people thought he had dropped off the map. A lot of people didn't even know he was still involved. And that was the last time he would be seen. He lost about 50 pounds. And I remember his sister Amy told me that she hadn't seen him in a few years, and she saw that, or certainly, I think she hadn't seen him since the last time fans saw him, because she lived out in Vegas. So they weren't seeing each other all the time. And she was so shocked. She called the family and said, what's wrong with Robert? He looks terrible. I mean, it was a very shocking thing.
Yeah, I'll never forget. Like, I still to this day remember our response when we saw it, and the name Gorilla Monsoon came up on the screen. We were like, oh my God, that's not really him, right? It was jarring, certainly, and unfortunately, several months later, you hear of his passing, which, is a sad situation. But we go back real quick to Royal Rumble 88. He has the heart attack right around that time frame, but it's not another year later. The Gorilla gets a little physical on the primetime set, attacked, of all people, by Steve Lombardi, the Brooklyn Brawler. And we just recently covered that on our Wrestling Memory Grenade. Gorilla had not been physical with anybody, to the best of my knowledge, after his retirement. I mean, I know he did a few fill-ins for Andre and things like that in the early 80s, but basically once he was retired, he was retired. Boy, yeah. I don't want to get back in the ring. I'm too old for this kind of deal, and I'm glad I'm not in there with these youngsters. And then he agrees to do this. Was this like, who was this a favor to? Why did he want to get active like that?
Well, he hadn't been physically involved since the WWF expansion. So there was one incident where he took part in the Big John Studd Body Slam Challenge in 1983. Right. And he was already retired by then, and he tried to slam Big John Studd. He wound up getting sneak attacked and, kicked on the ground by Big John Studd. So that had been the last time, but that was not before a national audience. So this was the first time at the time when fans across the continent knew him. I wish I could say that I know why in the world that moment would be given to Steve Lombardi. I do not know. I do not know. I wish I could talk to, I should have asked, I talked to Nelson Swegler, but I think he was still involved with the show at that time. I really don't know, but it was what a gem, what a way to introduce him as a character, because, and they have this whole exchange the next week, which is so interesting because it shows in a weird way, it actually shows the friendship between the two people. This weird dysfunctional friendship between the two characters even.
Yes.
Because they're talking back and forth, and Bobby, who is a heel, is apologizing to Gorilla, saying, I never meant for this to happen to you. That wasn't supposed to happen. It's not a very heelish thing, to do. No. And Gorilla is outraged. I can never trust you again after that. You really feel like, wow, these guys are kind of friends in this weird way. Right. I thought it was great.
It was like a bickering marriage kind of deal.
Yes.
And the funny thing is, we just
lover,
Exactly. We just covered that episode like 2 weeks ago on the grenade, so it's very fresh in my mind. Bobby apologizing for the entire 2 hours. Gorilla's like, "I'll never trust anything you ever say again, Brain." And it's great banter back and forth. And I'll wait till I get a hold of that piece of garbage, And Bobby's like, "Hey, that's between you guys." So even Bobby, who now manages the Brawler, he's like, "You want to beat his ass? Go for it, Gorilla." Right. But like, I don't have anything to do with that. That Rooster guy, that's another situation.
Right.
So Gorilla gets physical. I guess you could call that him getting physical. Brawler gets physical with Gorilla Monsoon, and they kind of drop that. And then many moons later, Vader comes in, and that was amazing because you didn't expect Gorilla to get physical, and he starts throwing his chops. I don't know if I had marked out like that in 5 years. Maybe since the Warrior won the belt at WrestleMania 6 that I jump out of my seat for something, and then I never got so angry at someone. Vader dropping Gorilla and hitting the big Vader bomb out of the corner on him. And obviously a way to get Vader over right out of the rip. He comes in, debuts at the Rumble the night before. He does that Raw, and then he's suspended because he's got the shoulder injury or whatever. They bring him in with the shoulder injury. So we got to write him off immediately, but let's write him off with a bang, right? And so Gorilla agrees to do that again. Tell me about, did he complain of soreness after that? Because that's a long way from getting hit in the back of the head with a bar stool, and then Big John Studd about 13 years before that.
Right. It was also, as you mentioned, it was partly to cover for Vader having to leave to get surgery, so that it helped get him over too. But from what I had heard from talking to people, Gorilla was very involved in that. He absolutely wanted to do it. He was very interested in doing it. I think he saw Vader as like a 90s version of himself. There were a lot of similarities there. They were both around the same size in their prime. They worked in a lot of the same ways. Vader was known as being a very agile big man in his prime, and so was Monsoon, even though a lot of the stuff we see is from later in his career when he wasn't so mobile anymore. In his prime, he was a freak of nature. I mean, cartwheels, flips, splits in midair. He could do crazy stuff. So I think he saw this as someone who was worthy of that. The thing is, and Jim talked about it in the book, he was in the ring when it happened, and they were just honored to be able to work with him in this way. And he said how Gino really took charge, and he told him, "This is what we're going to do, and you're going to do this, and I'm going to do that." And Vader, who sometimes had a reputation for having a bad attitude and being confrontational, Vader was just like, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir." Just very much.
That's amazing too, because Vader just walked into the company. It had that big long run in WCW and of course New Japan. So it's good to know that he still had that respect for someone he likely never met before.
He did. Now, one thing I heard this from Tom Carlucci, who was a WWE TV producer who was very good friends with Gorilla, and who was like his driver and stuff for years. I can't remember if I put this in the book or not, but he claimed, even though Jim said he didn't remember anything like this, but Tommy claimed that Gorilla was actually a little annoyed after the match because he thought Vader was a little too stiff. And he was complaining a little bit like, "Hey, listen, that was a bit much in there." But I couldn't really corroborate it. So actually that may not be in the book, but it was just funny that he said that.
Well, I feel like it would have popped up here in between discussing Gorilla with the Brawler, Gorilla with Vader, but was there ever, because in the back of my mind, I like to pretend there was there ever a discussion of getting Gorilla in the ring for one more match, preferably with Bobby Heenan, but just in any general way, did he ever try to get back in there for one more deal, or was he just totally fine with being retired?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He had zero interest in doing that. I don't know if anyone ever asked him or pitched him anything, but he never had the slightest interest in doing anything like that. He retired officially in the WWF in 1980. He was like 43, which half the WWE roster today is older than that. He was 43, and he did a few more matches down in Puerto Rico, although they were few and far between, and he actually took like a year or two where he did nothing. And then he went down there because he was 10% owner. He wanted to help them out. He did a handful of matches thinking no one on the mainland is going to know about this, which was true at the time. And he did a few as a favor, And then he really was done at that point. 83 was the last actual match that he had, which just a few months before Hulk Hogan won the title. I mean, he was already the announcer in the WWF, and he did a handful of matches and then wrapped it up for good.
Well, we, like I said, just recently covered that primetime. And so when I'm watching it sometime, my one son, who's like super fan, he's like a teenage me, but I didn't have all this. Well, we had the internet, just starting the infancy of the internet back when I was 16, but he has everything at his fingertips. Boom. It's like it took me, 20 years to learn what he could learn in 2 weeks, but so I'm sitting there and I'm doing that primetime Brawler Attacks. And my son goes, why don't they do Gorilla and the Rooster versus the Brawler and Bobby Heenan at WrestleMania? And I said to him, I go, because nobody's going to give a flying shit about the Brawler or the Rooster when Gorilla gets in there with Bobby. And I said, plus after he chops the shit out of him, how do you put that back on primetime the next week? I was like, I need them on primetime. So
I think that might have also been part of the thinking behind that these guys have to keep working together, but also that they would overshadow things. And actually, both Gorilla and Bobby were very mindful of things like that. They were both very smart about the business, and they were both very giving people in the wrestling sense. They were both they were men of good character, honestly. And Bobby Heenan, that surprises a lot of people because of his character on television. He was a very good man, and he didn't want to hurt people's careers. He wasn't the kind of guy that would intentionally hurt people's careers, and neither was Gorilla. So that was not something that they would have been that keen to do, honestly.
Relive the glory days of Memphis wrestling with the Retro Wrestling Review USWA podcast. Each week, we go back in time to review USWA Championship Wrestling from the 1990s, episode by episode. Join us for watch-alongs, behind-the-scenes stories, and exclusive interviews with people who were there and lived it. Whether you grew up watching it or you're discovering it for the first time, this podcast is your ringside seat to Memphis wrestling history. It's all a part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Listen now at USWApodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here. Lots of new stuff happening here at WrestleCopia, and I want to update you on everything going on with the brand right now. First and simple, if you haven't checked out our website at WrestleCopia.com, it's a great way to keep up with the latest episodes of all of your favorite Copia programming, from the Wrestling Memory Grenade to Regional Rasslin with the Territory Talk, the Wrestling Stoop with the legendary Bob Roop, Professor Dan Ginnity and the Pro Wrestling Academy, and all the other great podcasts from Gene Jackson, Bob Smith, Dave Dynasty, and the boys from the Other Ship. And of course, all of those programs also available at your favorite podcast streaming platforms. And if you want to stay up to date with everything going on in the Copia world, all the latest news, random thoughts, fun videos, pictures, and more, make sure to join the more than 33,000 followers over at Facebook.com/WrestlingGrenade. Don't be left out. Please also follow us at the former Twitter, now X, at Wrestling Grenade, and subscribe to YouTube.com/WrestlingGrenade. Would also greatly appreciate you leaving us a 5-star review at your favorite podcast apps, guys, because every positive review makes our podcasts more visible in the algorithms, if you will, which allows us to continue to grow. Now, for those who have been asking about merchandise, WrestleCopia merch, you can find plenty of designs for our t-shirts, hats, magnets, stickers, coffee mugs, and more over at the TeePublic store. That is tpublic.com/user/WrestleCopia. And last but definitely not least, it's what keeps the entire machine going. I'm talking about patreon.com/WrestleCopia. Now with 3 major tiers and tons of Patreon exclusive next level content for our supporters. Remember guys, no subscription, cancel any time, but I think you'll like the content that we're offering there for any budget you may have. And you can sign up right now, patreon.com/WrestleCopia. We appreciate your support in helping us pay the bills to keep the WrestleCopia Podcast Network running and enabling us to continue to bring you all of the quality programming that we offer.
Hey, it's Bob Smith, and guess what? The Outdated Wrestling Hour is now part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. But hey, no fear, you're still going to hear the unique guests, comedy, music, authors, journalists, funny people. Who knows who's going to end up on the Outdated Wrestling Hour? Remember, it's all new and all old. So check it out in the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and wherever you get your podcasts. Listen if you know what's good for you.
Well, we spent some time talking about the announcing side of things. I do want to get into a little wrestling. I'm sure the older fans or the fans looking to hear a little bit more about Gorilla prior to his retirement from the ring would like to hear a little bit about some of the other stuff. Now, you covered a lot of that with Cornette, but you've got a billion more pages of it there in Irresistible Force. Believe me, guys. So when Corny was talking to you and he was asking you a few questions and you were like, no, it's okay, we can give this away because there's like 8 million more things in the book. I love that because there is really 8 million more things in the book. So there's nothing to be really afraid of here to discuss a little bit anyway. And so as you were talking with Jim, you mentioned how Gorilla kind of got a piece of the pie in 1969. And I go, didn't he turn babyface in 1969? So I started putting the puzzle pieces together right before you said, what a coincidence that he turned babyface as soon as he became part owner, which makes sense because now he's going to be around more. We're going to see him more in that authority figure, kind of walking around, maybe wearing a suit, whatever the case may be. So not so much the heel Gorilla Monsoon from Ithaca to Manchuria now to Jersey. He's a New Jersey boy all of a sudden. No real explanation. I always wondered, what was the explanation? There wasn't one, right?
No, there wasn't one. He just started talking. He just started being a normal guy. There really wasn't one. I mean, I get into the book in some detail about how the face turn happened and things that went on, which was so hard to do because there's no surviving television. There's no way to talk to the people involved directly. And what I had to go on were people who were kids at the time and saw it on television as fans. I went by that, among other things. And because even Gorilla himself in interviews, he would look back on it. People would ask him, you know, how did you go from a bad guy to a good guy? And he didn't even remember it the right way. It was really weird how he said in some interviews that Dr. Jerry Graham attacked Bruno and he saved him. And I looked it up, and Dr. Jerry Graham was in jail at the time. Which is not hard to believe. And so I'm going, okay, it's clearly not him. And so I had to kind of put it together. And you're right. The angle that they did on television that initially turned him face was in Washington, D.C., literally on the same day that they signed the paperwork, because I had copies of the paperwork that I got from Tim Hornbaker, and it's dated and everything. And they just flipped the switch. Yeah, they said, look, you're going to be around. You're not going anywhere. We can't have you as a monster heel because you're going to lose your heat. You're going to be, you're going to turn into a prelim guy. You're going to, like what happened to Baron Mikel Cicluna. And he didn't want that. He wanted to still be the attraction and make money. And so they thought, well, if you're a baby face and you're an attraction now and you're kind of like a semi-main event guy and people like you, we can keep you around forever and your schedule will be less. He was not involved anymore in any like real top level angles or anything like that going forward. Although he was Pedro Morales' manager, so there was a little bit happening there. So that was a very conscious decision. Like, you're here to stay now. You're invested in the company, so we're going to turn you babyface.
So I jumped a little too early into the wrestling side of things. There was one more question I wanted to ask you before we move away from commentary completely. And that was, Gorilla was very well known to exaggerate things in his commentary, literally hanging from the rafters, Brain.
Yes, literally.
And
yes.
literally, they're hanging from the rafters. I could see them. Or sometimes he would get the anatomy wrong. Anatomy 101 with Gorilla, it was, he could say external occipital protuberance, and he would be the little bump on the back of your head, but sometimes some other things. And Dave Meltzer was big to point those out when he was incorrect, by the way. Dr. Dave out there. But so I gotta get into it with you. Did Gorilla know that he was, I know he knew he was exaggerating, but did he realize how much he was exaggerating some of the time, or did he think nobody would catch on?
Well, believe it or not, Gorilla had a minor in biology and anatomy in college. And I think that he learned a lot of even though they may have been misremembered or mistranslated, he learned a lot of the terminology then. And he probably was drawing on that solar plexus and lower lumbar region of the back and the lateral and collateral ligaments, which I don't even know if there are collateral ligaments. I think he just made that up. What else was there? The intercostal cartilage he would talk about. the bursar sack he brought up. There was something in the neck. What was it? Something about the vertebrae. What the heck would he say? I forget. But he had all these things in his back pocket. He would always mispronounce the word behemoth as behemoth to the point where
that's right.
Behemoth, to the point where that became wrestling vernacular. Vince McMahon would say behemoth. A lot of other announcers have said behemoth. That's not even a word. It's B-E. It's behemoth or behemoth, you could say. It's not behemoth. But, I think it was a combination. So one thing is he was very much, I think, trying to emulate the wrestling announcers of the past who would use a lot of cliche and a lot of references like that. He was, from what I understand, he was a great admirer of Gordon Soley. And everybody got to see Gordon on cable on Georgia Championship Wrestling, and some of the announcers that he heard early in his wrestling career. And I think he was trying to emulate that a little bit too.
All right, guys, I had to get that in. I do apologize. We went into the wrestling world. We came back into that, but I would have kicked myself later if I hadn't have brought that up. So we'll continue on, though. We'll get back into the wrestling side of things real quick. Gorilla Monsoon. He comes in as a heel right around 63 thereabouts, if I remember correctly, and he's doing the monster heel shtick. Now, many moons later, in one of the WrestleManias or something, Jesse Ventura and Gorilla are having banter, and Jesse asked him, "Did you ever have a manager, Gorilla?" And Gorilla's like, "Oh yeah, Wild Red Berry, or whatever." And so, but I had read that Gorilla's first manager in the WWF, the Capitol, was Bobby Davis.
Yes.
Can you verify if Gorilla had been managed by Bobby Davis? Because I'd read Bobby Davis is the one that brought Gorilla into the company.
That is true. And by the way, that mention of Wild Red Berry, I think it was WrestleMania 4. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people, and I'm another one, people that are fascinated by wrestling history. And that was a moment when we were kids where we were like, "Oh, what is this? Who's this guy? What is that?" We're getting like a little tidbit about Gorilla's career, a specific tidbit, which he never really got into so much. And I think Jesse's response was something like, "Whoa, that's a blast from the past," or "Wow, right. I haven't heard that name in a long time." And, it's funny, like you say, it is true. Bobby Davis was his first WWWF manager. Gorilla had 2 runs in the 60s as a heel that were broken up. So he was there from mid-63 into the beginning of 65. And then he went to California for like 2 years. Or a year and a half. And then he came back and he had another heel run in 67 to early 69. Now, during the first run, Bobby Davis was his manager. And Bobby Davis had been brought out of basically retirement to manage him. Bobby Davis had been a manager in Capitol going back to the 50s, and I think for Al Haft as well. And he had gotten out of the business very young. In the early 60s, he was investing his money. He was getting involved in other businesses, real estate and things. And he had a falling out with Buddy Rogers. And so he had walked away from the business. And when Gorilla came in, he was specifically approached. I think Killer Kowalski was one of the people. And there were other people who said, "Bobby, this guy'd be perfect for you. Come back and manage this guy." And the angle they used was Bobby Davis had been gone for a long time because it was months, it was months.
Sure.
But after Buddy Rogers had lost the title to Bruno, this was the storyline. Bobby wanted to get the belt back, and he was desperately looking for someone that could do this. And he went to Manchuria, and out in the wilderness, he found this lunatic, bathing naked in a stream. That was the storyline.
Ooh, that's not a pretty sight.
And he brought him back to America. And so Wild Red Berry at the time was hooked into the Capitol office. He was an early member. He was like in later years what Freddie Blassie would have been and Arnie Skoland and all that. Wild Red Berry in the 60s was that. And he was very close with Vince Sr. So Wild Red Berry had known Gorilla already. And when Gorilla went out to California, Wild Red Berry went out with him. And I think part of that was to kind of like take care of him, look out for him, because they knew he was going to be coming back to New York. That was always the plan. We just want to freshen you up. So he went out and he worked for Roy Shire. He worked for the LaBelles in LA. And at that time, Red Berry became his manager. And they were very close. Red Berry, he got married out in California, Gorilla, to Maureen. They were married out there. And Red Berry and whose real name was Fred Berry, but Red Berry and his wife were the witnesses at the wedding. They were very close. And they came back. When they came back, Red Berry was his full-time manager in New York for that last heel run. Now, it's odd to me that Gorilla never would mention Bobby Davis when he would talk about his managers, even in newspaper interviews and things. He only mentioned Wild Red Berry. So I'm tempted to think there was an issue there. There was some kind of falling out. I don't know for sure, and I could not figure out what it was, but that would be a very safe bet. He never once mentioned him.
Okay, yeah, that was really peculiar, years later when I was able to do more digging thanks to this lovely world of the internet. But you're right. As a kid, those little nuggets like that, man. Wild Red Berry, what's that name? Okay, add that to my notebook of names I got to try to figure out and learn about. And
you know what I wish? I will say this. I actually got in touch with Bobby Davis before he passed, and we had a couple of phone calls. I did a lengthy interview with him that I posted online at the time, and I was really excited to find him. And I never asked him about Gorilla because I think I honestly at the time didn't know that he had managed him. I would have loved to have brought that up because he would have known the answer for sure, whether he would have talked about it or not. But I never got a chance to ask.
You would have at least gotten his version of the falling out if there was one at all. So New York, as we call it now, is known as the big guy territory, but DC, it wasn't really the big guy territory per se. It was the Nature Boy Buddy Rogers deal, right? I mean, like wherever he was kind of doing the drawing as the heel per se. But of course he has the health issues. Bruno gets the belt. Now Bruno needs guys to whip on. And so, there's a lot of bigger talent beginning to kind of spill into the territory, but no bigger than Gorilla Monsoon. And I heard you talking about this with Jim Cornette, and Gorilla was legitimately, we take this for granted now. We'd seen it our whole lifetime. The monster heels coming in to challenge Backlund, to challenge Pedro, to challenge Bruno and Hogan even, and things like that. But Gorilla was technically really the first monster heel. He started the whole thing here in the Northeast trend.
Yeah, particularly from like a homegrown perspective. Obviously, Gorilla had been wrestling for about 3 years by this point, but he was not a known commodity. He was not really a major star. He had done a little bit of main eventing in Toronto and Calgary, but certainly not what you'd call like a national wrestling star. And the feud with Bruno made him into a national star, even though wrestling was regional, thanks to the magazines and thanks to the fact that it was New York, which carried a lot of weight in the business. He became a known commodity, a main event guy. And he was the first. He was the first monster heel of WWE, going back to the WWWF, and that became their model for years and years, into the Hogan years and probably even beyond that. The heels we're going to have these giant maniacs that are going to challenge our sweet beloved literal baby faces, although Bruno certainly did not have a baby face, but he was a baby face. And Gorilla was the first. The summer of 63, it was July of 63 that he came in. And it was partly because of Buddy Rogers that he got his spot, because the idea had been they were going to have rematches. It was going to be a whole program of Buddy Rogers trying to get the belt back. In fact, there was even talk that he was going to get it back, and then Bruno might have to win and try to get it back from him. They were going to try to do something like that. And Buddy had flaked a little bit. Part of it was health concerns. He had that heart problem. And I do believe there was. Some people have said he was a liar, even Bruno.
Bruno didn't buy that.
Well, it's not that he didn't buy that. I think Bruno didn't want to diminish his win by saying, gotcha, I beat a guy who was at death's door, Yeah. So he had some heart issues, some health problems. And he was also getting very political. There was even talk that he was trying to take the territory over. He was trying to move in and figure out a way to finagle his way in. And so Vince had a little bit of buyer's remorse about backing Buddy. And so they had wanted to do this return angle. And in fact, there were some tag team matches after Bruno won the belt where Buddy pinned him in tag team matches.
Oh, okay.
Because they were trying to build up like, oh, could he win it back? And so they had this big match booked for Roosevelt Stadium, which is like a minor league baseball stadium in New Jersey, and still there, I think. And that was supposed to be the match. Buddy had a falling out with the promotion. He was gone. They needed somebody in there. It was so bad that the tickets, on the actual tickets for the event, that they printed, it still says Bruno Sammartino versus Buddy Rogers. And it was the Roosevelt Stadium show where Gorilla made his big splash. I described the match in blow-by-blow detail, which I was so thrilled to do. There's no video, of course, but there are accounts in newspapers where the reporters are describing everything. And I was able to put that in there, and it was the night that made him a star.
Nice. I haven't gotten there yet. I'm looking forward to that part. Yeah, that's going to be fun. You talked about footage. You talked about that with Jim as well in regards to there's nothing out there. There's a couple episodes like with Bill Watts and things like that from the Capitol, but outside of that, there's really nothing. It's amazing. You see a lot of LA, you see a lot of Chicago, and of course the Dumont Network and things like that are popping up these episodes of these matches, but New York and Washington and Vince Sr. and Toots Mondt being the money makers that they were at the time, you would think that that would be a market where they would be preserving some of the footage, and that was simply not the case. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, and I was kind of hoping you would come up with some, I happen to know that there is some footage. No, there's not. And that broke my heart to hear that, because unless somebody turns it up somewhere, somehow, I don't even know how that would be. It's sad to think that an entire decade or plus of Gorilla's career is just lost. His entire heel run is gone. It's not there.
So the only stuff you can see of, Gorilla Monsoon, the heel wrestling, is stuff from Japan, because they were very good much better about preserving their footage there. You can get a feel for that, including right before he came to the WWF. There's some stuff from the spring of '63, right before he came in. And there's other stuff from a little bit later in the 60s, and some of it in color. The thing about, you mentioned the Capitol Wrestling, there's two, as far as I know, there's two or three full surviving episodes of Capitol. The problem is, one of them I've seen is from the late 50s, and he wasn't wrestling yet. The other one is from 1965, when at that time he was in California. So any chance of him being on those, is non-existent, of him being around. So there's no way, really. There's one other thing, and somebody pointed this out to me since I made that statement, but it's very, very brief. Recently, this came to light again. There was a thing that it was like an ABC News magazine program or something in 1967 or 8 or 9. It might have been 9. They did a profile of wrestling at the Garden. And they did little snippets of footage. There's footage of Bruno at the Garden wrestling Killer Kowalski, which is unbelievable, because there's also almost no footage of Bruno from the first reign in the Garden. There's stuff of Bruno out to dinner after the match, talking to, Johnny Valiant, who had made his debut at the Garden that night when he was John L. Sullivan. There's footage of him and of Bruno and Vince Sr. in the Capitol Wrestling hotel suite at the Warwick, just shooting the breeze, talking. And there is a brief, I'm talking seconds, of Gorilla wrestling. I think he's wrestling Bruno from another match. I can't quite tell who he's wrestling, very briefly, but of course the whole thing might be in the ABC vaults. Who knows? But that's really literally all there is. Actually, what's interesting is it's from early '69, and they do have a brief comment in the locker room of Gorilla Monsoon talking, which he wasn't even talking on television at the time. So it's very strange. He talks in totally normal English for ABC.
Well, sometimes you got to do what you got to do.
You're right.
I suppose, you talked about his Japan stuff, and luckily, some of that footage does exist. We just recently covered that on our Pro Wrestling Academy podcast, where we cover the history of Japanese wrestling. And, watching Gorilla go in there and work with Baba, and they're throwing drop kicks, and Gorilla's moving around, taking that big man bump over the top rope out to the floor. And it was so amazing to see what he was able to do, because most of, like you said, what we have of Gorilla is he's kind of ballooned up, and maybe he's still doing some things, but man, was he nimble. They talk about the best big man and the agile big man. He was doing things that guys half his size weren't necessarily doing during that period. So he really went overboard in trying to get himself, over beyond just, I'm a big guy. Like, he went out there and he took it seriously. He took great bumps. He delivered great moves. And, he's doing, like you said, cartwheels and things of that nature. So it's, you got to wait a minute. You don't see this every day kind of deal. So Gorilla, that's the footage that's out there, though, unfortunately, is just which is great stuff. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, that entire heel run, it's unfortunate. And we just have bits and pieces of stuff that trickles out through the 1970s from Gorilla, who didn't work a lot on TV. Eventually, he would just kind of do the house shows more so. But we come across and Gorilla gets a piece of the pie. He becomes part promoter, part owner of the company there by the end of the 60s going into the 1970s. Was there any discussion that you know of throughout the 70s of Gorilla moving away from the ring way before obviously he does there in the early 80s? I know he slows down as time goes on, but was there ever talk, all right, well, you're 25%, was it at the beginning anyway?
25 at first, and he sold part of it to Arnie Skolin. By the end, he had 20%. Yeah.
Okay. So was there ever discussion at any point like, all right, we got to take you out of the ring and you need to focus more on this, or was Gorilla just collecting cash? I mean, how did that work him as a quote unquote promoter?
I think he was happy to double dip in that way. Like, as a wrestler, he peaked early, and part of that was by choice. Part of that was his shape that he was in. By 1970, he'd already peaked, and that's the thing as a wrestler. And so part of that was he didn't have to do all that stuff anymore. Gorilla understood that the business was about making money. He didn't need to do those things anymore. He was set for life. And also, I don't know if I talked with Jim about this, but I've talked about this and it's in the book. He had an incident in Australia where his, he used to wrestle with contact lenses. So because he was so blind. Mm-hmm. And he got some kind of a serious infection in one of his eyes because of dirt getting under the contact lenses while he was wrestling in Australia. He almost lost his eye. And from that point, he stopped wearing the contact lenses. That's crucial. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. So that affected the way he worked too. It was going to be very ground based. It was going to be, I'm going to chop you. I'm going to splash you in the corner. I'm going to stand in the middle and you're going to bounce off me like Dusty Rhodes, that kind of thing. But that was understood. This is what I can do. And I think his thinking was, because he was putting on weight. He got up very famously as big as 440, which is probably about 100 pounds heavier than he was, say, as a college wrestler. And even at 6'6", that's a lot of weight to carry around. So I think he just felt, I'm going to keep doing this until I'm not comfortable physically doing it anymore. And then I'm going to stop because I don't need to do it anymore. And that's kind of what he did.
Take me back to the Muhammad Ali situation. Gorilla's out there as the All-Asiatic Champion. Again, I had to scribble that down in my notepad back in the day. All-Asiatic Champion, Gorilla Monsoon. They just kind of give him that title. And he's working Baron Mikel Cicluna, his former tag team partner from many years ago. Chops him straight out of the ring. There you go, Baron. And Muhammad Ali just happens to be sitting in the front row. Obviously, they're building towards Inoki and Ali.
Right.
But did Ali have any background or knowledge of who Gorilla was? Did Ali pick Gorilla to do this? Like, how did they come about getting Gorilla Monsoon as the man to do this spot with Ali? For those of you who haven't seen it, Ali gets in the ring, throws a couple jabs, and Gorilla just kind of hooks him up into the airplane spin and cuts that promo. Doesn't know a wrist lock from a wristwatch. I always love that. But how did that come about in regards to how did they get Ali to agree to take a bump for Gorilla? I guess is the question.
Yeah, the All-Asiatic Champion from Willingboro, New Jersey, which is actually how he was announced. So that came about. They were lucky in a way because they were doing TV in Pennsylvania. And Ali had a ranch in the area, not too far away. I mean, it wasn't right next door, but it was reasonable driving distance. And so they thought, well, we could do this. Now they were building toward Ali versus Inoki. That was the match. And the WWF and the McMahons were heavily involved in the promotion. They were a part of this as the liaisons in North America to get it out there on closed circuit and everything. So they wanted to do an angle. The thinking was back then, as a lot of people have said, back in those days when they would talk about boxers versus wrestlers, the conventional wisdom, this is pre-MMA and all that, was always like the wrestler wouldn't stand a chance. The boxer's just going to hit him and he'll go down and that's the end of it. And so they wanted to put doubt in people's minds. They wanted to put doubt in their minds that maybe Ali might actually lose. So they did an angle where they wanted to say, well, we got to put him in there with someone really dangerous who will really overwhelm him and make him look like helpless. And Gorilla was the guy. I mean, and they knew he'd play ball because he was involved in the promotion. He was a stakeholder. He was part owner of the company. So That's how that came about. But Gorilla was not a big fan of that whole thing. He just did not like the idea of doing things where you didn't have full control. He didn't like, working with boxers or working with outside people where things could go wrong. He was very conservative in that way. In the end, he got proven right because it was kind of a mess when they did the actual Ali Inoki match. But that's
Ali was never the same, they say, right? Wasn't he like hung up in the hospital there?
His legs, his legs were wrecked because Inoki stayed to get into that. But people might know the details where Ali balked at the last minute. I think there was some talk originally that Inoki was going to win on some kind of a fluke and they would build to a rematch. Ali balked at the whole thing, so they went in there and it kind of turned into a shoot because neither guy knew what was going to happen. So Inoki, very wisely, not wanting to get his head knocked off, he stayed on the ground the whole time, and he kept kicking Ali in the legs and Ali's legs were bleeding. They had to take him to the hospital afterwards, and it definitely messed with him physically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy stuff. But I go back, I have to think, even though Gorilla was a little trepidatious on getting in the ring with Ali there, at the same time, you talk about him being, had a stake in the company. I don't know that anybody's going to try. Wait a minute, I get to beat up the greatest of all. I get to be on top, and he goes down to me. And okay, yeah, we'll do that. At least, and that was in the highlight reels forever. That was on Best of the WWF Volume 1, guys. I remember that because I remember getting that tape and going, "Holy shit!" That was the first time I'd seen the situation. And everybody knew who Muhammad Ali was. You talk about household names. You didn't have to know boxing to know Muhammad Ali. He was the greatest, And so I just thought it was so weird. It was. Seeing the wrestling boxing dynamic. I didn't know the Inoki thing in the mid 80s as a kid. I just knew that for some reason Muhammad Ali was sitting front row at a wrestling venue. But we go back real quick, and Gorilla is a heel. You talk about his peak, his prime. They threw everybody at him. Bruno Sammartino, Victor Rivera, Spiros Arion, Bobo Brazil. And then fast forward, and Gorilla as a babyface, he's kind of just doing tag matches and working whoever, doing semis, getting people ready for Bruno or Bob or whomever the case may be. And then comes the epic night where Superstar Graham captures the title in the late 1970s there. And the very next Garden card, Graham was slated to wrestle Gorilla Monsoon, but now it was a title match. And I don't know, there's like a billion matches out there. Maybe off the top of your head, you recall how this one starts. But it starts off hot. Yeah. And within like 1 minute, you think Gorilla Monsoon's going to be the new champion. I mean, every move he had left in his repertoire, which was chop, 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 splash, but he hit him, and the crowd was going nuts, and I'm going nuts here. And like just recently watched that on our Coliseum video cast in 2025, and I'm going nuts now. Is he going to win the belt? No, of course not. But it was amazing for that just little brief period, that little short spurt. Could he do it? You know what I mean? So was there ever discussion of putting the belt even briefly on Gorilla, or was not going to be that draw?
No, I don't think there was. But the idea was this. It's like anytime, because the WWF was a babyface champion territory. So mostly babyfaces never got title shots because they didn't do heel versus face matches there either in that territory. And so anytime a heel would win the title briefly as a transitional champ, the babyfaces would finally get a chance to wrestle for the title. And actually, Gorilla had challenged Ivan Koloff, believe it or not, in the 3 weeks that Ivan Koloff was champion. There's more than one title defense against Gorilla Monsoon, but they were not high-profile matches. Now, with Superstar Graham, this was going to be a little different. He was still, in a way, if you think about it, very much a transitional champion, especially in those days when the title reigns were so long. But the transition was 10 months instead of 3 weeks. And so Gorilla was the first challenger for Graham at Madison Square Garden. Graham had won the title in Baltimore because they didn't want to have a big Garden riot. So they changed the title in Baltimore. Graham's first appearance at the Garden, he's defending against Gorilla Monsoon. Now, you have to imagine at the time, even fans who were not smart to the business, they had figured out this pattern. It had happened with Koloff. It had happened with Stasiak. In fact, if you wanted to go back, it even happened with Rogers, where the idea is, a bad guy's going to win the belt, but then very quickly he's going to lose it to another good guy who's going to hold it for a while. And you have to imagine on that night, and I think that that's what they wanted them to think, that the fans are going, Gorilla's going to get it. This is it. This is the moment. And that's why the match is so hot, and Gorilla almost wins within seconds, because that would have been the kind of thing they would do. Have Graham win the belt, and then just a squash, and now Gorilla's the champion. Hooray! Everything's good again. That's what they wanted people to think, very much, and so they played off that. Yeah,
and that's kind of what we get many years later. Backlund beats Bret for the belt at Survivor Series, and then by the weekend, Superstars. Without any explanation, we just cut to a garden show, and Diesel's beating Backlund in 8 seconds.
I was there for that also. Yes, I was there that day.
And, I wasn't the biggest proponent of Diesel getting a world title to me that early in his career. But at the same time, the fact that heel Bob Backlund character, which I was not a giant fan of as when the bell rang, anyway, I'll put it that way. And I was like, yeah, all right, I'll take it, whatever the case may be. So Diesel was the champion, but I can imagine back then being at the Garden, what was that, 77 with Gorilla and Graham.
Yes, 77, yeah. Watching
the camera shake, the stationary camera kind of shake when he hits that splash, but they're right by the ropes, and it just wasn't meant to be. To quote the Gorilla, you got to hook the leg, at the end of the day. That's how you get it done. And the fingers are locked, Jess. Those two are a couple of my favorites. So speaking of my favorite things, and this is one I picked up on as a kid, and to me, I think people are starting to latch on. I'm going to take the credit for this, even though I really can't. But since the beginning of our childhood, we used to watch the Survivor Series, and Gorilla would randomly reference the peanut butter pie. And I'm like, what the hell's a peanut butter pumpkin pie? There's that. What the hell's a peanut butter pie? And we would, have fun with that as kids, my cousins and things like that when we would watch everything. And I never heard anybody ever mention peanut butter pie. And then, I start mentioning peanut butter pie. It's part of my shtick that I do. And all of a sudden, all sorts of peanut butter pie references online. Now, I'm not saying they got it from me. Maybe there's just more Gorilla watching going on nowadays. But please tell me somewhere in there's mention of peanut butter. Somewhere in this book. Of these
there is. There is.
I love it.
Peanut butter pie is mentioned in the book. And that is a shoot. Gorilla loved peanut butter. This was told to me by his daughter. He loved peanut butter. And in fact, what she said to me was, look, this guy, I love this man. He was wonderful. He had a horrible diet. He just ate whatever he felt like. And apparently his favorite, guilty pleasure thing to eat and have was a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of orange soda. Okay. That would be his favorite thing to have. And I think it's actually the last thing he ever ate too when he came home before he passed away. But that was his favorite thing. And it was legitimately his favorite thing at Thanksgiving, just like he would say. But he really did just eat anything. There's a story that Davey O'Hannon told in the book, which is astonishing, where they were working out together, or they were playing racquetball. Believe it or not, Gorilla was a big racquetball player, and that was probably the only form of exercise he got outside of wrestling. But so he was playing with Davey O'Hannon and Dick Worley. There were a couple of people, and they came back to Gorilla's house to hang out. And Gorilla was like, "Hey guys, you want to have some ice cream or whatever?" And he took. This is the way Bobby described it. He took 2 pints of ice cream, cut them in half in the pint box, cut them in half, split them, put them on a plate, took a sleeve of Oreo cookies, crumbled them up on top of the 2 pints. Whew. And Davey said something like, "Is anybody else coming?" Who's coming? And Gino's just like, "No, this is for us." And and Davey just couldn't believe it. In fact, I think then Gino goes, "Should I put some chocolate syrup on top?"
Oh man.
And Davey says, "Why not? We can't possibly go more wrong than this."
Right? Yeah. Oh man.
He just didn't care. He didn't care.
I never had a sweet tooth, so it never really, hit me. But you could always tell Gorilla did have the sweet tooth. He seemed like a simple man, and you kind of verify for a guy who always carried around, as they say, $10,000 in his back pocket, because you never know when you're going to want to buy something.
Right.
But to his classic go-to, his comfort food was a peanut butter sandwich and orange soda. It's just
yes. It's comfort food. That's a good way to describe it. Yes.
It's a Gorilla thing to do in my I can kind of see that. So I'm telling you guys, you're missing out. You need a bookmark with just the recipe to the peanut butter pie right there. Use it in the book. I'm telling you guys right now. But I love the fact that it's mentioned in the book. So
it is.
You left no stone unturned. So I love that. So let's fast forward. We talked about the heel. We talked about the babyface a little bit. We talked about commentary. Near the end of Gorilla's run with the World Wrestling Federation, he had a secondary job as part of Bingo Break, which was like a local talk show, game show. Sean Mooney was on it too.
Yeah.
But what was really unique about it was he was still Gorilla Monsoon on WWF TV, but here in this local market over here, he's Bob Morella. How did that come about? And more so, how did Gorilla or anybody involved feel about him having a real name, knowing he's still this nationally known Gorilla Monsoon?
Well, the show came about because of Nelson Swegler, who had been the head of television production before Kevin Dunn. Kevin Dunn was there. He worked for Nelson. He was like an assistant director or whatever, and he got Nelson's spot. Nelson left in 93. So he left in 93, and he went back to Baltimore, which is where he was from. That's why the WWF used to do all their studio taping in Baltimore before they got their studio. And he had this idea to do this show, Bingo Break, which would be like combination talk show, variety show, but also like an interactive game show where you could buy like tickets at local stores and play numbers, and they would announce the bingo numbers. And he thought that Gorilla would be a no-brainer for this. He always had great respect for him as a presenter and as a speaker, and he also knew they weren't using him as much on television in the WWF, so he might have more availability. So he reached out to him, and what Nelson told me, because I interviewed him for the book, was that the thinking behind the name was, look, Gorilla Monsoon is your wrestling persona. That's your wrestling character. This has nothing to do with wrestling. Let's use your real name. And as far as I know, he had no problem doing that. And Sean Mooney was like the MC or whatever. And I had Sean,
the bingo guy.
Yeah, he picked the numbers. He was already gone from the WWF by then. So Nelson had reached out to him because he knew him also. I had Sean on my podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle. That episode has not come out yet, but I said to him, look, Bingo Break, we got to talk about this. And he went into detail about Bingo Break. So there's some stuff in there too, but it's one of these weird, surreal moments of Gorilla's career. It contains the last public interaction between Gorilla and Bobby Heenan. Bobby Heenan was an announcer for WCW. Think about that. Yeah. You have a contracted WCW commentator and a contracted WWF commentator appearing on television together. It's a very surreal moment. But, the show is not meant to be. They were hoping it was a local Baltimore thing. They were hoping it was going to get picked up nationally on Fox. It did not. And Gorilla just went back to Stamford, Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was, by for all intents and purposes, it was fairly milquetoast, but it was your typical morning show type deal. And I would have just watched it based on the fact that Gorilla Monsoon was on my screen. But and Sean Mooney's just calling out I-51 or whatever the hell. People are giving me shit right now because 51 is not in the I category, but that's okay. And anywho, one more question before we wrap things up here. And this is, I wanted to make sure I got this one in. So many years ago, I think it was before podcast, even for Jim Ross, but he mentioned somewhere, I don't know if it was in his book, in an interview or something along the way back when he was there, Gorilla was still doing commentary as well, that in the post-production, when they were doing, the voiceover work for like Challenge or whatever the case may be, that in between takes, Gorilla would just sit there and shit on some of the stuff that was going on in the mid 90s, which rightfully so, Mantar and all that good stuff. So I got to ask you, like, did you hear, just give us, like, maybe if you have one good story of something the Gorilla shit on once upon a time that never obviously made it to air?
Well, there were definitely things he didn't like that he was seeing in that time. And I think one of the biggest problems, I don't even know if it was so much the characters and things, because there were some crazy characters when Gorilla was wrestling. I think he was critical of their work. I think he came from an era where, it's funny, we talk about it now, like we reminisce nostalgically about the 90s now, but I think from his point of view, I mean, he had seen the greats, man. You're talking, and he felt like a lot of the guys were phoning it in. He thought some of their work wasn't very good, and there were things that were really bothering him about what they were doing in the ring. I think some of the critical stuff he would do on commentary was almost like a watered down version of his real reactions to things and how guys would work. I have a speech in there that I transcribed when he was honored by the Cauliflower Alley Club. And he was much more candid than he would be with the WWF. And he said things like, back in my day, ... we actually knew how to work, like that kind of thing. As far as specific things from that time that he really, I had heard, and this is much later, people told me that definitely there were some things in the Attitude Era that he was just rolling his eyes, like things like the oddities and bringing in the Howard Stern people, and just the idea of the McMahons getting physically involved was something that really bewildered him. He was not a fan, even though he was going toe to toe with Stone Cold, nose to nose. He was a company man. He was not a fan of some of the edgier stuff they were doing and using vulgarity. And I want to point out specifically, this is not to say that he was like a choir boy and he didn't use these words in his personal life. Certainly did. But in those days, guys of that generation, there was a difference. This is for private life. This is for, you don't say this stuff on television. There's kids watching, there's families. So he was not, it was told to me flat out by people, he was not a fan of the Attitude Era. So I could tell you that for sure.
I could kind of feel that, not necessarily even listening to some of the commentary he did, that international stuff later on you were talking about, but just in general, it just felt like it was almost like you took him from a different generation and plopped him down into that. Just didn't fit. It was just two different worlds. And I could see where anybody from that era would look at this and go, what is this? We don't need to do this, but it worked for the short term anyway. I mean, financially, certainly it helped Vince and company throughout that time period and enabled the bigger boom again with the Raw versus Nitro and everything that went along with that. But Gorilla Monsoon, an amazing figure, the Irresistible Force versus the Immovable Object. Obviously, that's where you get the term for the book, Irresistible Force, The Life and Times of Gorilla Monsoon. Brian, I want to thank you so much for being here, but I want you to tell everybody where they can find this book. Sure.
So it's put out by ECW Press. So it's a wide release, which means you can get it anywhere books are sold, honestly. I want to say if you're in Canada, it might be a great idea to order directly from ECW Press. In America, it's a little tougher because the postage and the shipping is crazy between the two countries and everything like that. But Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all the big book chains you can order. I'm sure most people will get it through Amazon. But even, honestly, your local bookstore, if you're lucky enough to have one, or brick and mortar Barnes & Noble, they should be carrying it. If they're not, just ask them to order a copy for you, and they will absolutely do that for sure.
I love it, man. Thank you so much for spending the last, about 90 minutes with us here on the program. I mean, hopefully I didn't pick your brain too much here. It was a great conversation. I could, continue to talk about his gambling habits, Puerto Rico, everything on down the line, but we'll save that for the book. We'll save that for everybody to go out there and grab their copy today, as much as I have as well. So I appreciate you being here, Brian. Would love to have you back somewhere down the road to just talk some more old school wrestling, man.
Sure thing. Anytime you call me, I'll be there. Like I said, I love what you do.